So you've decided to display your new home's network in a network rack. I think that's an awesome idea. But how do you really know which rack will work best for you, what size to get, and things of that nature? In today's video, I'm going to give you my 3 top tips for planning and designing a network rack in your new home so you can get it right the first time. Hey guys, welcome to the Ethernet Blueprint. My name is Tim Tritch, and on this channel, we focus on helping people just like you build a great network in their new construction home. And today's video is gonna be about that, the network rack. How do you plan for this thing? So there's a lot of choices out there, guys, budgets all over the place. So today we're just gonna kind of focus on what you need to be thinking about so you can plan the network rack in your home properly. So let's get started. Now, before I get into the 3 things, I just want to talk freely here for just a second, because I think a lot of people may look at a network rack and say it's unnecessary. Why would I do that when I can just do a shelf? But one of the things I want to kind of step back is there's a lot of positive benefits to using a network rack. One, it's just a nice way to display your gear. I mean, this looks nice, right? A lot of times with shelves, you got cords, going all different directions, and it's kind of harder to hide those things. So they're a little more out in the open, a little more exposed. This is actually a really clean and nice way to show off your equipment, okay? And number 2, you can actually add a layer of physical security. So with a network shelf, or even this rack right here, which is an open frame rack, there are fully enclosed racks that are lockable, so you can actually lock your equipment up and make sure that nobody has access that isn't supposed to have access. So that is a really great benefit as well. And because you can either, floor models, maybe put it under a desk or maybe mount it up high so it's up out of the way and you can stack things underneath of it, with the mounting options, they are really practical because it allows you to get your stuff kind of out of the way so you're not tripping on it. Like I think a lot of times happens when someone just puts their network equipment just on a shelf in an office. Now they've lost that shelf. So I highly recommend, if you have the space and you're thinking about it, I really do recommend having a network rack. Now, this one here has only network or rack mountable gear inside of it, but that you're not limited to that, right? There's things like a network shelf like this that you can actually install to put Sonos gear in here, or maybe put your modem on it, stuff that isn't rack mountable. And so we're going to talk about that as part of the benefits in sizing this thing correctly. But just know you're not limited to just putting, rack mountable gear in it. So without further ado, I just wanted to talk real quick, but without further ado, let's get into the top 3 things you need to be thinking about when planning a rack in your house. All right, tip number 1, which type of rack do you need in your home? Now, here's what I mean by this. There are a couple different flavors. Typically, there is the open frame rack, like you see here, and then there is a fully enclosed rack. And so what I want to do in this part of the video is just sort of talk about maybe some of the pros and cons of both to help you make a decision as to what you're going to need in your home. So let's talk about the open frame rack first. Now, I really like an open frame rack. But there are some downsides, all right? So the first and foremost, it makes getting to your equipment, working on something very, very easy. I don't have to take this thing apart to get to my equipment. It's all very, very exposed and easy to work with. 2, there are a ton of tie-off points. Because it's just a basic frame, as you're Velcroing your equipment and stuff like that, that usually gives you a lot of tie-off points to make your gear inside look as good as possible. However, one of the drawbacks is because it's open from all angles, it's a little less forgiving on hiding cabling on the inside. If you have long patch cables and you have it hidden and it's just laying inside here, you're going to notice it in an open frame rack versus a fully enclosed one. But if you don't have a need for physical security like I do at my house, I'm not worried about my kids coming in here and plugging something in they're not supposed to. However, I do run into homes where that happens, right? The kid has a restricted VLAN or something, and he goes and moves his Xbox into the non-restricted port, and presto changeo, he's good. So there are needs to physically secure a network. So that's where a fully enclosed rack really comes in handy. Typically, the side is solid, the top is solid, the bottom is solid, and the back is solid on those, okay? The doors on the sides come off, and then there's a front door that swings open in a lot of cases, and that you can fully remove too. So you still have the ability to get to all angles of your equipment, or most angles of your equipment, which makes them easy to work in. However, some assembly required, right? You need to go get the key, you need to unlock the doors, pop open the panels, set them out of the way, and then put everything back and physically secure your gear after you're done working. All right, the other thing to kind of think about is, where is your cabling right here coming into your home? One of the nice things I like about an open frame rack is because the back is open, I can actually put the rack over where my cables are coming in into the room or whatever, and sort of hide that. With a fully enclosed rack, this back panel is solid in a lot of cases, not every case, but it is solid. And so there's some maybe limiting factors about where you could put this. I could literally put this rack anywhere I wanted to on this wall and run my cables up into it. If I had a solid back rack, you know, one of the racks that's completely enclosed, I would either have to put it below it or above it to ensure that my cables can get in there, because typically there's a slit up top that allows you to remove it and get your cable in that way, or from the bottom. So, you know, the limiting factor about where your cables are coming in kind of plays a part in this too. And to me, that's a downside. Now, one of the misconceptions, very common misconception, is that if you have a fully enclosed rack, your equipment will stay cleaner. I kind of want to squash that, because that really isn't the case. There is air circulating around inside the rack no matter which way you go. And it is pulling air, especially if you have a fan on top, it is pulling air from outside the room into the rack and blowing air onto it. So really all it's doing is circulating or recirculating the air that's out there. So if you did plan on maybe putting this thing in a garage, for example, just know you're still going to have to get in that thing and clean equipment. I have some warehouse racks that I'm blown away at how dirty they get. And they're fully enclosed, locked up, nobody can get to them. You know, I've got to protect the gear in case, you know, something backs into it or you bump it with a ladder or something. But at the end of the day, it gets extremely dusty. So I think one of the common misconceptions is they don't want to use an open frame rack because your gear is going to get dirtier. And while the fully enclosed rack does offer some level of dust protection, it's not foolproof. Your equipment's still going to get dirty. So if you're thinking about it from that standpoint, just understand that no matter which route you choose, you're going to have to still clean your equipment. But both the racks have a lot of benefits to it. You really just need to ask yourself, is that physical level of security something that's important to you? Do you want to be able to lock this thing up, maybe from kids in the home or you know, other needs? Just having stuff locked away makes you feel safe and everything. I completely understand that. In that case, you're going to want to do a fully enclosed rack. Just pay attention to where your cables are going to come in your home, or maybe even dictate it based off of what type of rack you're going to choose. But both are great options, but the first thing you're going to want to look at is what type of rack you're going to want in your home. Okay, tip number 2, sizing your rack. How big of rack are you going to need in your space to be able to house all your equipment? So I wanted to give you a couple things to kind of think about as you're putting your information together to pick the right size of rack for you. So the first thing we want to talk about is, how are racks sized? Okay, so racks are usually determined by their rack units. So the rack here behind me is referred to as a 6U, or rack unit rack. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each rack unit allows for one piece of hardware, that is a 1U piece of hardware, to be mounted in that space. So this switch, or my router here, is a 1U piece of hardware. This cable manager is a 1U. This patch panel is 1U. They have 2U. They have 4U. They're all sorts of things. Where you run into it a lot of times is with the UPS. A lot of UPSs, you know, are taller, right? So they're a 2U unit or a 1.5 unit sometimes, just depending on the size of it. But so you really need to understand what is going to go into this thing, or what could go into it in the future. Guys, remember, future proofing here. You don't want to buy a new rack if you buy new equipment, right? So this one is very, very specifically sized for my lab. However, if I was doing this in my home, and I can even show you my rack, I have a full-size rack for my normal house, and it's got a ton of space in it, so I can add whatever I want to add into it down the road. But you have to think about this from your home, your perspective. Do you have enough space for a rack? Where's this thing going to go? Are you going to mount it on a wall? Maybe it's going to set on the floor. Is it going to go under a desk? If it is a floor mount, is it going to have casters on it, the wheels, right? That gets it up off the ground a little bit. So therefore it takes away some of your space. So it's kind of a game we play about where's this thing going to go, how much space is there, and what equipment is going to go into this thing. So once you kind of choose the size of your rack or the type of rack you want, you need to be looking at size. Now, a couple things I recommend. If you do have the space, guys, I recommend going a little bit bigger with your rack, all right? For two real reasons. One, it is going to allow you to add equipment later, right? Or let's just say this switch gets upgraded to a 2U switch next time. Maybe they change to a 2U switch. So having a little extra space for the unknowns of things is a really big benefit to you, okay? The second big benefit I like about it is it allows you to space out your equipment, all right? So I think typically people think that when they're going to put their gear in, they'll just stack it all together. But from a cable management standpoint, from a cabling standpoint, it can be harder to cable your gear up and make it look nice if you care, if all your equipment is compacted and sitting next to each other. So it's nice to put some space in there, have cable management. Maybe you have a patch panel. Maybe you have 2 patch panels, right? It's nice to be able to make that cable leap over a 1U space. Okay, maybe there's just a blank here and you're jumping over it. It's nice to have that extra space built into your rack to make things look nicer. So my advice is if you have the space and where this location is going to go, and you know what kind of equipment you're going to need to put in this thing, I would recommend going a little bit bigger if you can. All right, so no matter which type of rack you decide to get, allow for additional space. Okay, so I want to add kind of a part 2 to tip number 2 in sizing your rack. And that is, we're going to talk about the depth. So when you're out shopping for racks, you'll see a couple different variations out there, and they do come in different sizes. But one of the things you want to look at is how deep is your equipment that's going to go into that. Now, this is a standard network rack, okay? It's about 18 inches deep, give or take, all right? But it limits the size of equipment that I can put in here because of how deep it goes inside the rack. And you can see based off of what I have in here, my switch and my router, I still got plenty of space back here. However, if your network rack or your rack is going to count or include something like an AV receiver or something like that, a lot of times those are pretty deep because they pack a lot of components and stuff inside of those. Plus, you need to make sure you have room for the power cable sticking out the back and all the cables that need to plug in the back. That's got to come in. You don't want it bunched up against the wall. So understand the size of your equipment that's going inside your rack so you can size it accordingly. All right, so this is what I refer to as the standard network rack. It's a typical network rack size. Obviously, they're taller, but if you bought this same rack but in a 12U, it would be this same deep, but it'd just be taller, okay? Then they have AV racks. AV racks a lot of times are fully enclosed. They typically don't leave them open frame, I don't think, or at least I don't see them a lot. So they're typically enclosed. A lot of times they sit on the floor. But they're going to have a little bit more depth, maybe 24 inches or 27 inches of depth to allow for larger components like your amps, like your receivers and other AV components of a home. So understand if that stuff's going in your house, you're going to want to size this thing accordingly. And then you're going to see server racks, and server racks are very, very deep. They have plenty of space to be able to encompass a full-size rack-mounted server. Most of you, that's going to be overkill. I don't imagine a lot of you will have servers running in your house that are full size. So I would think that between a regular standard network size rack or an AV rack, one of those two should fit the bill. But you guys want to look at what equipment's going to go in there and understand how deep it is so you don't buy something that's too small. number 3 may not apply to everybody, but it is a good thing to think about just in case. And that is talk with your vendors. Now, homes today are built completely different than they were even just 15 years ago, okay? And so we're cramming a lot more stuff in our house. We're having to work with a lot of outside third parties to install things in our house, maybe special lighting. I've seen golf simulators. Pool systems are getting more complicated. There's AV systems, all sorts of things that are going into homes that would require the vendor to install their components or their equipment into a network rack. So by talking and knowing which vendors you're going to work with ahead of time, maybe they already have a rack and you just need to make sure that your equipment that you want to install in your house will fit into that rack. So it's always a good idea to talk to those vendors and find out what they offer, what they're planning on doing. It may be much simpler than actually going out and shopping on your own and then having the turmoil of going back and forth about whether or not their equipment will fit in your rack, okay? Sometimes it's easier just to go with the rack they choose. It's already part of their build, and they know that rack will work with their equipment. Most network equipment can fit in just about any rack, especially one that's going to be a little bit larger to facilitate some of those larger components. So tip number 3, guys, talk to your vendors, know what's going in your house. And I know that seems like common sense, but as you're kind of piecing this thing together, it can get really easy to get off track or get narrow focused on, I need this much space for my network, and you kind of forget about those things. I've gone into houses that actually had a network rack like what you see behind me, and then also an AV rack, which didn't really make sense. It took up a lot more space than what was really necessary. All they really would have needed to do is just make a little bit bigger rack, facilitate this equipment in there, and it could have been solved. But I think there was just a communication gap about what the vendor was providing versus what the homeowner needed to provide, and so they got off track. And just having that communication with your vendors can alleviate that from happening. So tip number 3, talk to your vendors and know what they're bringing. If they have the option to put a rack in your house, look at maybe adding your equipment to their rack as opposed to the other way around. There you go, guys. My 3 top tips for planning a network rack in your home, things you need to be thinking about. I hope you found it helpful. Like always, guys, like, follow, subscribe, all that good stuff. Hit the bell so you don't miss any new videos. We are going to be putting out content more regularly here out on YouTube to help you plan and build a great network in your home. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below, and I will do my very best to get that answered for you. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you in a future video.